Imagine a teenage boy scrambling through the cliffs above a shimmering desert lake, tossing a rock into a dark cave and hearing something shatter. He doesn't know it yet. Neither does anyone else. But that sound, echoing off ancient stone somewhere in the Judean wilderness in early 1947, will detonate like a slow-motion explosion across biblical scholarship, archaeology, and religious history. It will force experts to rewrite timelines, reconsider sacred texts, and ask questions that had seemed settled for centuries. What exactly was hidden in those caves, and why? Who put it there, and when? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what do these ancient documents tell us about the Bible we think we know? Stay with this story, because what began with a shepherd boy and a thrown stone became one of the most consequential archaeological discoveries in human history. The boy's name was Mohammed edh-Dhib, Mohammed the Wolf, as his nickname went, and he was a young Bedouin shepherd from the Taamira tribe. The year was 1947. The place was the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, in what was then British Mandatory Palestine, a region on the edge of enormous political upheaval. The cliffs there are dramatic, pale limestone ridges honeycombed with natural caves, rising sharply from the desert floor. The air is brutally dry. Almost nothing rots in that environment. Almost nothing decays. That detail will matter enormously. According to the most widely accepted account, though some details of the story have shifted over the years as different witnesses gave different versions, Muhammad and his companions were searching for a stray goat near a site called Qumran. He threw a stone into one of the cave openings, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps to startle the animal. What he heard in return was not the bleating of a goat. It was the crack of breaking clay. He climbed in and found tall, sealed ceramic jars. Inside some of them, wrapped in linen cloth, were ancient leather scrolls. He had no idea what they were. Neither did the merchants in Bethlehem who first looked at them. But within months, those scrolls would find their way into the hands of scholars, and the academic world would erupt. To understand why this discovery was so explosive, we need to step back about 2,000 years. We need to understand what the world of ancient Judea looked like, what was at stake for the communities living there, and why someone might have gone to extraordinary lengths to hide their most precious documents in a remote desert cave. The 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE were among the most turbulent periods in Jewish history. The region of Judea had been under various foreign powers for centuries, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks. By the time Rome entered the picture, Jewish society was fractured. There was no single, unified Judaism. Instead, there were competing sects, competing interpretations of Scripture, competing visions of what it meant to be faithful to God and to the law of Moses. You had the Pharisees, who emphasized oral tradition alongside Scripture. You had the Sadducees, the priestly aristocracy tied to the temple in Jerusalem. You had the Zealots, who believed armed resistance against Rome was a religious duty. And then there were others, smaller groups, more reclusive, who had essentially given up on mainstream Jewish society and retreated, sometimes literally, to live apart. It is almost certainly one of these groups that left behind what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here is the first thing that genuinely surprises people when they learn about this discovery. The scrolls are not a single document. They are not one lost gospel or one hidden book of the Bible. They are a library. A vast, fragmented, astonishing library of somewhere between 800 and 900 individual manuscripts found across 11 different caves near Qumran between 1947 and 1956. Some are nearly complete. Most are fragments, tiny scraps of parchment and papyrus, some no bigger than a fingernail, painstakingly pieced together by scholars over decades. The texts fall into several broad categories. About a third of them are copies of books from the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. Another significant portion are texts that belong to no known tradition, sectarian documents, hymns, legal codes, apocalyptic visions, and a remarkable text called the Community Rule, which appears to be a kind of constitution for a disciplined religious community. And then there are the texts that don't fit neatly into any category. Writings that had been known only through later translations, or writings that had been entirely lost to history until a Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into a cave. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated and genuinely fascinating. For centuries before 1947, the oldest known manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew dated to around the 10th century CE. That's the Common Era, meaning those manuscripts were written roughly 1,000 years after the events they described, and more than 1,000 years after the texts themselves had been composed. Scholars had always known this was a gap. They had always wondered what might have changed in those intervening centuries, through copying, through translation, through the inevitable human errors of scribes working by lamplight across generations. The Dead Sea Scrolls answered that question in a way no one had fully anticipated. Among the very first scrolls identified was a nearly complete copy of the Book of Isaiah. The entire book, 66 chapters, preserved on a single leather scroll about 7.5 meters long. Scholars dated it to approximately the 2nd or 1st century BCE, making it roughly 1,000 years older than any previously known Hebrew manuscript of Isaiah. When they compared it to the traditional text, the Masoretic text, the authoritative Hebrew Bible used by Jewish communities for centuries, the result was both reassuring and revealing. On one hand, the text was remarkably stable. The core of the Book of Isaiah had been transmitted with extraordinary fidelity across a millennium of hand copying. That was genuinely astonishing. It validated the care with which Jewish scribal traditions had preserved scripture, but there were also differences, hundreds of small variations. Some were trivial, spelling differences, minor word choices, but others were more significant. And when scholars compared the Dead Sea Scrolls not just to the Masoretic text, but also to the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, which had been made around the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, they found something remarkable. Some of the Dead Sea Scroll texts aligned more closely with the Greek Septuagint than with the later Hebrew Masoretic tradition. What this suggested was that in the centuries before the Common Era, there was not one single, fixed, authoritative version of the Hebrew Scriptures. There were multiple textual traditions in circulation simultaneously. The text of the Bible, in other words, was still fluid, still developing, still being shaped. This was not a scandal. It was not proof that the Bible is false or unreliable, but it was a profound historical insight, one that changed how scholars understand the formation of Scripture and the complex living process by which ancient texts were transmitted, edited, and eventually standardized. Now, who actually wrote these scrolls? Who hid them? And why? The site of Qumran, the ancient settlement closest to the caves, had been excavated by the French archaeologist Roland de Vaux in the 1950s. What he found was a complex of buildings, communal spaces, a large cistern system for ritual bathing, and most intriguingly, what appeared to be a scriptorium, a long, narrow room with writing tables and inkwells, exactly the kind of space where scribes would have worked. De Vaux's interpretation, which became the dominant scholarly view for decades, was that Qumran was home to a Jewish sect known as the Essenes. The Essenes had been described by ancient writers, by the Jewish historian Josephus, by the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, and by the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, as a group of pious, ascetic Jews who lived communally, practiced ritual purity, shared property, and had withdrawn from what they saw as the corruption of mainstream Jewish society, including the Jerusalem temple establishment. The fit seemed almost too perfect. The community rules scroll described exactly this kind of disciplined communal life. The sectarian texts spoke of a group that called itself the Sons of Light in conflict with the Sons of Darkness. There were elaborate purity codes, a hierarchical leadership structure, and an intense focus on the correct interpretation of Jewish law. For most of the second half of the 20th century, the Essene hypothesis was treated almost as settled fact in popular accounts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But here is the honest picture. It is more complicated than that. Since the 1990s, and especially since the full corpus of scrolls became available to all scholars rather than a small circle of specialists, a story of academic gatekeeping and controversy in its own right, alternative interpretations have gained serious traction. Some scholars argue that Qumran was not a sectarian community at all, but a country villa, or a pottery manufacturing site, or even a military fortress at different periods in its history. Others argue that the scrolls were not produced at Qumran, but were brought there from Jerusalem, perhaps from multiple libraries, and hidden in the caves as Roman armies closed in. The truth is that historians still debate the precise origin and nature of the Qumran community. The Essene connection remains the most widely cited explanation, but it is a hypothesis, not a proven fact. Certainty in archaeology is rare. What is not in dispute is the timeline of the hiding. The scrolls were almost certainly concealed in the caves sometime around 68 CE during the catastrophic Jewish revolt against Rome. Roman legions under the general Vespasian, who would soon become emperor, were systematically destroying Jewish settlements throughout Judea. Qumran itself shows signs of violent destruction at this period. The people who lived there, whoever they were, knew the Romans were coming, and so they did what people throughout history have done when they know something irreplaceable is about to be lost. They hid it. They wrapped the scrolls in linen, sealed them in ceramic jars, and tucked them into the dark, dry caves of the cliffs above their settlement. Then they left, and they never came back. For nearly 1900 years, the scrolls sat in those caves, perfectly preserved by the extraordinary dryness of the Dead Sea region, one of the driest places on earth. No moisture to rot the leather, no insects to consume the parchment, just darkness, silence, and time, until Muhammad edh-Dhib threw his stone. The story of what happened next is almost as dramatic as the discovery itself, and considerably less flattering to the institutions involved. After Muhammad and his companions retrieved the scrolls from Cave 1, they brought them to a merchant in Bethlehem named Khalil Eskander Shahin, known as Kando. Kando sold some of the scrolls to a Syrian Orthodox bishop named Athanasius Yeshua Samuel, known as Mar Samuel, who sensed he had something valuable but wasn't sure what. Mar Samuel tried to show the scrolls to scholars at the American Schools of Oriental Research in Jerusalem and was initially turned away, a decision those scholars would spend years regretting. Meanwhile, the Jewish archaeologist and scholar Eliezer Sukenik from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem managed to acquire 3 of the scrolls through separate channels, conducting his negotiations in November 1947, just days before the United Nations voted on the partition of Palestine, in the middle of escalating violence between Jewish and Arab communities. Sukenik later wrote that he was aware of the historical irony, acquiring texts 2,000 years old while the fate of the modern Jewish state hung in the balance. Mar Samuel eventually brought his scrolls to the United States, where he tried to sell them, famously placing an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal in 1954, describing them as the 4 Dead Sea Scrolls and asking for buyers. The advertisement was spotted by Yigael Yadin, Sukenik's son and himself a prominent Israeli archaeologist and military figure. Yadin arranged their purchase anonymously through an American intermediary for $250,000. The scrolls were brought to Israel and are now housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem in a purpose-built structure called the Shrine of the Book. But the story of the scrolls' scholarly journey was far from smooth. After the initial cave was discovered and the first scrolls acquired, a systematic archaeological search of the region began. Between 1949 and 1956, 10 more caves were found containing scroll material. Cave 4, discovered in 1952, was the most extraordinary. It contained fragments from hundreds of different manuscripts, but they were in pieces. Tens of thousands of fragments, some microscopic, jumbled together in the dust. The task of reconstructing and publishing these fragments fell to a small, internationally assembled team of scholars working in Jerusalem, and here the story takes a troubling turn. The publication process became extraordinarily slow, so slow that it began to look, to outside observers, less like careful scholarship and more like deliberate restriction. By the 1980s, decades after the discovery, the vast majority of the Cave 4 fragments had still not been published. Access was controlled by a small group. Other scholars who wanted to study the texts were denied. Theories multiplied. Some suggested the unpublished texts contained material so explosive, so theologically challenging, that the scholars, many of whom had religious affiliations, were suppressing it. The speculation reached a fever pitch in popular culture. The reality, when the logjam finally broke in the early 1990s, was both more mundane and more interesting than the conspiracy theories. The delays were primarily the result of academic bureaucracy, personal rivalries, the sheer difficulty of the fragmentary material, and a scholarly culture that treated exclusive access to primary sources as a form of professional currency. When a reconstructed edition of the text was published without official authorization in 1991, and when the Huntington Library in California announced it would make its photographic archive of the scrolls freely available to all researchers, the monopoly collapsed. The full corpus has been available to scholars ever since, and is now largely accessible online. No suppressed Gospels of Jesus, no hidden proof of a grand conspiracy, but But the actual contents of the previously unpublished texts were genuinely illuminating, particularly for understanding the diversity of Jewish religious thought in the centuries around the turn of the Common Era. Here is one of the most quietly revolutionary things the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed. The world into which both Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity were born was far more religiously diverse, far more intellectually dynamic, and far more textually complex than anyone had previously understood. Before the scrolls, scholars had a relatively thin picture of Jewish religious life in the Second Temple period, the era of the Jerusalem Temple before its destruction by Rome in 70 CE. The scrolls filled that picture in with extraordinary richness. They showed a community, or communities, wrestling intensely with questions that would echo through the following centuries. How should Scripture be interpreted? What constitutes ritual purity? How should a community be organized? What does God require of the faithful in a time of oppression and crisis? When will the end of days come, and what will it look like? Many of the themes and structures found in the Dead Sea Scrolls have striking parallels with early Christian writings. The community rules description of a communal meal with bread and wine, presided over by a priestly leader, has drawn comparisons to Christian Eucharistic practice. The scroll's use of the phrase, "sons of light," appears almost verbatim in the Gospel of John. The teacher of righteousness, a mysterious, messianic-sounding figure mentioned in several sectarian texts, has been compared by some scholars to Jesus, though most historians are careful to note that the parallels are suggestive rather than definitive, and that the teacher of righteousness predates Jesus by at least a century. What the scrolls do not show, and this is worth stating clearly, because the internet has not always been careful about this, is any direct connection to Jesus of Nazareth or to early Christianity. No scroll mentions Jesus. No scroll mentions John the Baptist, Paul, or any figure from the New Testament. The scrolls are Jewish documents, produced by Jews for Jewish purposes in a Jewish religious context. What they show is the rich, complex soil from which both Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity grew. They illuminate a world of intense religious creativity, scriptural interpretation, and communal experimentation that had been largely invisible before 1947. The physical preservation of the scrolls has been a scientific challenge as remarkable as their historical significance. When the fragments were first brought to scholars, many were in fragile condition despite the millennia of desert preservation. Early conservation efforts were not always successful. Some fragments were actually damaged by well-meaning but poorly chosen adhesives used in the 1950s. Modern conservation science has had to undo some of that earlier work. Today, the scrolls are studied using technologies that would have seemed like science fiction to the scholars who first handled them. Multispectral imaging, photographing the fragments under different wavelengths of light, has revealed text that is invisible to the naked eye, ink that has faded to near transparency but still registers under infrared or ultraviolet light. DNA analysis of the animal skins used to make the parchment has helped scholars understand which fragments might have come from the same original scroll and even where the animals were raised, providing clues about whether scrolls were produced locally at Qumran or brought from elsewhere. In 2021, researchers announced the discovery of new scroll fragments in what has been called Cave 12, found in the Cave of Horror, a site in the Judean desert named not for the scrolls but for the skeletal remains of refugees who died there during the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century CE. The fragments containing text from the Book of Zechariah and the Book of Nahum were the first new scroll material discovered in 60 years. They were found alongside a 6,000-year-old child's skeleton and a basket that turned out to be the oldest complete woven basket ever found. A reminder that the Judean desert has been a hiding place for the desperate and the precious across an almost incomprehensible span of human time. The political dimensions of the scrolls have never fully receded. The original scrolls were discovered in territory that was Jordanian administered from 1948 until 1967, when Israel captured the West Bank during the Six-Day War. The Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem, where the Cave 4 fragments were being studied, came under Israeli control. Palestinian scholars and officials have argued that the scrolls belong to Palestinian cultural heritage. Israeli institutions maintain that they are the patrimony of the Jewish people. The debate is ongoing, and it mirrors, in miniature, the larger unresolved questions of sovereignty and identity in the region. The scrolls, in other words, did not escape history. They emerged from one catastrophic moment, the Roman destruction of Jewish Judea, and landed in the middle of another contested and unresolved one. What remains after all the controversy, all the delays, all the political complexity, is the fundamental human drama of what these documents represent. Somewhere around the year 68 CE, a group of people, scholars, scribes, believers, perhaps soldiers, gathered the most precious things they possessed, the words they had studied and copied and debated and prayed over. The texts they believed contained the truth about God, about history, about the destiny of their community. They wrapped those words carefully, sealed them against the air, and hid them in the dark. They were trying to save something. They were trying to ensure that what they knew, what they believed, what they had spent their lives preserving would survive whatever was coming. It did survive, just not in the way they imagined. Not passed down through their community, generation to generation, the way they had hoped. Instead, it survived through the accident of geology and climate, through the extraordinary dryness of the Dead Sea Basin, through the chance trajectory of a shepherd's thrown stone. And what it preserved was not just text, it preserved a moment. A frozen cross-section of a world in crisis, a community under pressure, a tradition in the process of defining itself. It preserved the voices of people who lived at one of the most consequential turning points in Western religious history, and who left behind, in leather and ink and clay, a record of how they understood their world and their place in it. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not a scandal. They are not a conspiracy. They are not proof that the Bible is wrong or that religion is a fraud. They are something far more interesting than any of those things. They are a window into a world that had been almost entirely lost, the world of Second Temple Judaism at its most diverse and dynamic, a world teeming with competing visions of God and law and human destiny, a world whose tensions and arguments and hopes gave birth to two of the world's major religions. Every fragment matters. Every scrap of leather with a few faded letters on it is a voice from that world, speaking across 2,000 years of silence. The boy who threw the stone never could have imagined any of this. Muhammad edh-Dhib went on to live a relatively ordinary life. He died in 2004. In interviews he gave late in his life, he seemed both proud of his accidental role in history and somewhat bemused by the enormity of what that thrown stone had set in motion. He had been looking for a lost goat. He found something that changed the way humanity understands its own past. History is like that sometimes. The most consequential moments don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, in the form of a crack in the darkness, and a sound of something ancient breaking open. What do you think is the most significant thing the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed? The unexpected diversity of ancient Jewish religious life, the remarkable stability of biblical texts across 1,000 years of copying, or something else entirely? Drop your answer in the comments. Every perspective adds something to the conversation, and there are no wrong answers here. If you appreciate history told this way, without myths, without filler, and without pretending that the past is simpler than it actually was, subscribing takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps this channel keep going. In the next video, we are going to look at another world-altering discovery that reshaped our understanding of the ancient world, the unearthing of the ancient Egyptian city of Amarna, the city built and then deliberately erased by one of history's most radical pharaohs. That story is just as strange and just as consequential as this one.